Appreciate all y'all being here tonight. Robbie, would you lead us, please?
Father, thank you for this day. Thank you for all the many blessings you give us. Thank you for this opportunity to come back to your house tonight, Father, just to learn more about you, learn more about the Scripture, Father, and the resurrection. And pray to be with John tonight as he teaches. And go with us this week and keep us safe. In Jesus' name we pray.
Man, thank you. Appreciate y'all being here, and we'll continue on with these evidentiary clues about the resurrection. And one of them here is the New Testament testimony. And of course, we know that studying the New Testament, we know that the central theme is the resurrection, obviously. And as we talked about before, that was what the message was in the early church among Christians, was Jesus' resurrection. And so that obviously was what became so well recorded in the New Testament. The writers were undivided in their proclamation that Jesus rose from the dead. There wasn't any question. They declared it. They discussed it, the role that it played, the purpose of it, and so forth. And I think I mentioned last week that it's explicitly mentioned in all but 6 of the New Testament books. And the reason that it's not in those 6 is because they're concentrating on something else, of which the resurrection is not an integral part. And there's an example of, that's a 3rd century, a piece of revelation on papyrus from the 3rd century, which would be the 200s. And so they still find these examples of the old manuscripts of the Scriptures. And I like to look at those. There's the oldest one that we know of the New Testament. Goes back to, it's a small fragment of John. It's got writing on both sides of it. And it's from the 2nd century, early 2nd century. Some scholars think that it goes back to the 1st century. It may be may have been written or copied shortly after the events of the crucifixion and resurrection. But these letters, that is the letters in the New Testament, presume the truth of the resurrection as Jesus is portrayed as living and active. They interact with him. They pray to him. Paul speaks with him. He's revealed to Saul, as we heard about this morning on the Damascus Road, the resurrected Christ. And so the resurrection throughout the New Testament is viewed as central to Christian teaching, obviously. The Bible tells us that, and Paul wrote, if we be not resurrected, we're of all men most miserable, as Christ has not been resurrected. And so here's a quote from a famous theologian, Sir Frederick Kenyon. He said, "The interval then between the dates of original composition, the earliest extant means in existence, evidence becomes so small as to be in fact negligible. And the last foundation for any doubt that the Scriptures have come down to us substantially as they were written has now been removed. Thus, both the authenticity, the general integrity in the books of the New Testament may be regarded as firmly and finally established." This is a man who died in 1952 and who made this comment there. So he says there can be no question about the authenticity and the accuracy of the New Testament Scriptures. And he's not talking just about from a faith perspective, a biblical perspective. He's talking about a scientific, a literary, historical perspective. He's talking about there as well. So are the Gospels true? Well, the manuscript evidence for the integrity of the New Testament text is unprecedented prior to the invention of the printing press. In other words, there's far more information, manuscripts of the New Testament books, by far than anything from ancient times. Overwhelming amounts. Now, we don't have the originals. The originals, and I think I got that in here somewhere, the originals are called autographs. For instance, many people think that Matthew, when he originally wrote the Gospel of Matthew, that he wrote it in Hebrew, which is interesting, but they've never found any record of that. But it would have made sense that he would have, and then later it was translated either by him or someone else into Greek, which is what we have the copies of now. But none of the original writings of the New Testament or any Bible book exist that we know of. What we have are copies. And that therefore illustrates to us how important the method of copying these manuscripts was. They were so thoroughly careful, step by step by step. And Jesus said, one jot nor one tittle will not pass from this law until it all be fulfilled. A jot and a tittle were just little marks in the Hebrew language, sort of like a dotting of an I or crossing of a T for us. So more copies of the New Testament have survived. They are earlier copies than any other work from the ancient world. What that means is that these copies that we have of the New Testament scriptures, the manuscripts, were copied very close to the time of the crucifixion and the resurrection. And these are copies. So that means that the originals, the autographs, would have been even earlier, even closer. And that's not true of any other ancient work that we know of. So the time gap between the original New Testament and the first partial copies is 25 years, and the number of manuscripts is 6,000. Now, that's not including references and quotes of the New Testament in ancient time from the church fathers and so forth. They all wrote and they quoted the scriptures. That adds thousands and thousands more records of at least partial bits of the New Testament scriptures. So compare it to Homer. The time between Homer's life and the recording of what he did is 500 years, and there are about 1,800 manuscripts of Homer's work. Plato, who's so well known, was 1,200 years, and there are only 7 manuscripts compared to 25 years and 6,000 for the New Testament. So the New Testament has earlier and more testimony to its accuracy than any other ancient document. Now, all these other ancient documents and writers, historians, literary people, take it for granted that they existed, that what they wrote, and it's real. We have so many times more than that record of the New Testament, but they say, well, we don't know about that now, and it's unbelief. Because if they acknowledge that this is true, that the resurrection is true, then they're confronted with who they are in their sin, and that they're going to be judged by righteous God and righteous Creator. So here's, speaking of early autographs, this man, by the way, William Fulbright, if you study anything about biblical archaeology, he is the man. He was ahead of his time, ahead of everybody else in doing that work. And you see there, I included some of the things that he did. And he was such a great scholar and such an expert that he was one of the key people they consulted when they just started to discover the Dead Sea Scrolls. That tells you what a brilliant scholar he was. So his opinion carries a lot of weight. And he said, we can already say emphatically that there is no longer any solid basis for dating any book of the New Testament after about AD 80. Now, if you go and look at your King James Version of the Bible and your Schofield edition, and where it shows dates, proposed dates when it's written, it'll show you Revelation was probably written about 95 or 96. According to this brilliant man, it was much earlier than that. And so if John had a written Revelation, in defense of his position, if John had a written Revelation in 95 or 96, he'd have been 100 years old or older. And he may have lived that long. But it's more likely that he wrote it earlier. And he says that nothing after AD 80. It was all written long before that. Now, why that is so important is because it's so close to the event. The closer we are to a historical or past event, the more we're going to know about it. There are going to be people living who remember it. There'll be a living memory of it. Bimbo Brewer, I remember him saying years ago when they wrote an article in the paper locally about the 1903 tornado in Gainesville. And I think they wrote it in 1993 on the 90th anniversary of it. And Bimbo Brewer said, "We have fallen off the chronological edge." That stuck with me. I never forgot that. What he was saying was that there were no living people who had a memory of it that could really remember it. If anybody was still alive, who was alive at that time, they were so young they didn't really have much of a memory of it. So that's why this is so important, is how close the writings and the record is to the event. So if you think about it, if he's right about it being no later than 80, we're talking about less than 50 years after the crucifixion and resurrection. And for some of those books, much, much earlier. So there were people still alive who knew about these things, who had seen Jesus and heard Jesus when they began to write these books. I mean, the men who wrote them knew him, and a couple of them at least were his disciples. So there's some of the really powerful evidence outside of faith, beyond faith, that these are accurate. And that's what they wrote about. They wrote about the resurrection over and over again. I think I got that in there twice. So, going back to Kenyon, he said the New Testament tells us that the credibility and viability of the Christian faith stands or falls with the resurrection. That is the key. If Jesus was not resurrected, we're all wasting our time. And Christianity would have died out 1900 plus years ago. And the fact that we're here tonight and we're talking about this and we believe this by faith is powerful evidence that these things happened just as we're told that they did. Moving on to another one, because I mentioned this, or Nathan mentioned it in the tease, he calls it, the principle of embarrassment. And the principle of embarrassment basically means that when somebody admits to a fact that's embarrassing to them or somebody else, it's most likely true. We're not going to make up a story and lie about something that makes us look foolish or weak. We're not going to do that. And so in this case, we're talking about the people who had information about, evidence of the resurrection. Of course, the first ones were the Romans. So a key idea used by historians in weighing the historical validity of alleged events is who tells the story and why they tell the story. In the case of the Roman guards, it was because they were traumatized, something terrible. And they saw something that they could not understand or explain or comprehend. And so they went and told what they saw as best they could understand it. They were terrified. And so the writer included details that seems to hurt his position, and it could have been left unreported. Therefore, it's likely true. Why didn't you just leave it out? Ain't that what all politicians do? Politicians, if there's something negative, they don't talk about it. They don't reveal it. Somebody else has to reveal it about them. Criminals don't usually reveal their activity. Somebody else has to reveal it. So whenever they do, it carries a lot of weight. And it's known as the principle of embarrassment. But most importantly, in the case of the resurrection of Jesus, it was who first saw him after his resurrection. It was who first discovered the removed stone, the empty tomb. It was women. Why is that significant? Because in that culture at that time, women were not believed. Women could not testify in a court or a legal proceeding. That's why that when Mary went and told the disciples that the tomb was empty and that she had seen the resurrected Christ, they didn't believe her. Now they went to check for themselves on the tomb, but they didn't necessarily believe her. And so the fact that it was a woman and women who first discovered the removed stone, the empty tomb, and then saw the resurrected Christ, the first people to see the resurrected Christ were these women. And one of them was Mary Magdalene. Now, there's a debate about what kind of person she was. Excuse me. It's generally believed she was a very promiscuous woman before she met Jesus, maybe even a prostitute. But the Bible does tell us that she was possessed of devils. So she had to at least be mean. She had to be tough and mean. And so she was somebody, not only was she a woman, but she was a woman who was scorned and who was shunned. And yet she's the first person to see Jesus resurrected. Says something about the way God does things, don't it? So therefore, if you are writing a record of the resurrection of Jesus, why in the world, if you're making it up, why in the world would you say, well, the first person to see it was this woman? This probably promiscuous woman that nobody had any respect for, any regard for, except Jesus and a few of his followers. So it tells us there that it was Mary Magdalene, out of whom he had cast 7 devils, that first saw him, that he appeared to. So this is what Dr. Tim Chaffee says about it. He says it would make no sense for the writers to include this detail if they were attempting to gain a following, unless it was true that the biblical writers assigned Mary Magdalene as the first eyewitness of the resurrected Christ in strong support for the truthfulness of the account. I remember years ago here in Gainesville, they were having a big trial. They were trying a man for drug trafficking. He was a Colombian, by the way. We're talking 40-something years ago. This is before we knew about all the cartels and all. As a matter of fact, he was married to one of my cousins. That's why I remember a lot about it, for one reason. But he's Colombian, and he was a drug dealer. And the Hall County Man's Unit managed to arrest him and catch him with all kinds of drugs. And one of the people who was involved in that investigation was a man named John Attaway that I played high school football with. Ron Attaway's one of his sons. And he was on the stand testifying. And, of course, this Colombian had all these powerful lawyers. And he was testifying about how he got the information that led to a search warrant and the recovery of all this dope and the rest of this Colombian. And the defense attorney said, well, he talked about how sorry his informant was. And John, to his credit, said, well, he's the one who knew about it. If it had been the deacon board of the First Baptist Church of Gainesville, I'd have talked to them, but they didn't know anything about it. This guy did. And I never forgot that. What a brilliant answer that was. And that's what we're talking about here. Why did they name Mary Magdalene as the first person who saw the resurrected Jesus? Because it was true. Because she was the one that Jesus appeared to. That's why. No other reason in the world. And so probably some of these writers didn't like the idea of having to report it that way, but that was how it was. That was the truth. And and God had a purpose. Jesus elevated women to a level in society, in the home, in the family, in the synagogue, in the church that they'd never been elevated to before. I mean, after all, he was born of a woman. He had a mother he loved. He had sisters, half-sisters. He loved women. He loved the company of women. Mary and Martha, Mary Magdalene. He liked women's company. And he was a normal, perfect, sinful, sinless man, but he loved women and loved the company of women. He created them, by the way. He designed and created them. So that's what the principle of embarrassment is. It was these women. It was these women who were saying, we saw Jesus. He's resurrected. And they were going, they were hiding. The men were hiding. Let's face up to it. They were hiding. The women were doing something. The women had been witnesses to the crucifixion. Only one of the disciples, as we know of, was there. That was John. The rest of them were off somewhere hiding. And the women were there. They followed the body when it was taken to the tomb. We've talked about all of that. They returned on Sunday morning to further take care of embalming the body and making sure the body was properly buried. They were the ones who were there when the tomb being empty was discovered. The men wasn't there. The men were hiding somewhere. And so Jesus elevated them and honored them in a marvelous way. And I think that's probably the main reason, because of their faithfulness and their courage, that they were the first to see him, that he appeared to them. And he said, she didn't know who he was. She mistook him for the gardener. And he said, Mary. And she recognized him when he called her name. That's something. That's wonderful. That she recognized him because he acknowledged her by name. That means a lot when somebody knows your name, calls your name. You know, that's another little side thing here. If you got a mob, a crowd of people, a mob, it's getting out of control. Got that mob psychology. If you know some of them, you can call them by name. If you say, Adam, ain't you Adam? He's going to calm down because he's known now. He no longer has that, anonymity among that group of people. And so when he called her name, she knew who he was. He revealed that to her. So the straightforward reporting of the gospel writers adds tremendous weight to the authenticity. Not a single individual is said to have witnessed the actual event of Jesus rising from the dead. They wrote about the most important and dramatic event in history, and not a single person was there to witness it. That's another amazing thing about the resurrection. Nobody saw it. The most important event, not only in Christendom, but in the history of the world, the resurrection from the dead of the Son of God, and nobody was there to witness it. That was God's plan too. Because we can talk about this evidence all we want to, but it still requires faith to accept it, to believe it. You know, I mentioned, I think the first night, Thomas Jefferson didn't believe it. He says the most ridiculous thing he'd ever heard was the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And so it requires faith, no matter how much evidence God gives us, and he does, to help us to understand and to help us to believe. It ultimately comes down to faith. And so this most important event nobody saw. As I emphasized before, the Roman guards did not see Jesus. They saw the angel, the Bible tells us that. And they saw the stone go flying away from the entrance, we believe. They didn't see Jesus. We don't know at what point he left the tomb, or he re-entered the tomb, re-entered his body and then left the tomb. We don't know. But it was sometime early that morning, of course, on Sunday morning. And Dr. Chaffee again says that surely Matthew or Mark could have placed a respected man like Nicodemus or Joseph of Arimathea at the tomb to watch Christ rise, or at least to witness him coming out of the tomb. But these details are not recorded because the gospel writers did not make up the event. Instead, they accurately recorded what actually happened. And so the first people to know that Jesus was resurrected were the women when they got there on Sunday morning to further tend the body of the beloved Jesus. And why in the world, he's saying, Dr. Chaffee's saying, why in the world didn't they, if they were going to lie, why didn't they say that it was some famous man? Not only a male, but a very famous one, a well-known one, a trusted one. Well, Alexander Campbell, you see there, he says that to us, revelation has nothing to do with opinion or abstract reasonings. It is founded wholly and entirely upon facts. He says the facts are there for us to look at. Excuse me. And he goes on to talk about facts, about everything in the Scriptures that has been given to us by the Holy Spirit through the writers is facts. The Hebrew children were slaves in Egypt. That's a fact. God delivered them from Egypt, and they left. And they looted the place before they left. That's a fact. They wandered in the wilderness for 40 years. That's a fact. On and on and on. Joshua carried them across the Jordan into Canaan and conquered most of Canaan. That was a fact. On and on. Excuse me. And that's what he's saying here. That's what he's emphasizing. That even if you are weak in your faith, just look, because God gave us all the facts. And of course, that's a theologian who is what we call a literal interpreter of the Scriptures too, of course. So this is the last part I have on that, and I'm going to go through it right quick, and that's the alternative theories for resurrection denial, which shows the desperation of the enemies of God and the enemies of Christ, and how ridiculous ultimately they are, and how easily they're disputed or rebutted. A couple of them we touched on, but here's the first, and this comes from the Quran. In the Quran, chapters are called surah, S-U-R-A, as you see there. And they have chapters and they have numbers. And you see this comes from Surah 4, 157 to 58. And there it says, and for their saying, indeed we have killed the Messiah, Jesus, the son of Mary, the messenger of Allah. And they did not kill him, nor did they crucify him. But another was made to resemble him to them. And indeed, those who differ over it are in doubt about it. They have no knowledge of it except the following of assumption, and they did not kill him for certain. Now, let me stop here just for a minute. The world is in deep, deep trouble today because of Islam. Everybody's afraid of Muslims. If you're in England today, if you're in Belgium today, and you criticize anything about Islam, you're going to prison. In Europe, in Canada, and it's coming to America real soon. Nobody has the nerve to confront what Islam is. Islam is a false religion from the pits of hell. I believe that the person that Muhammad thought he encountered, his Allah, was Satan himself in that cave on that mountainside. And the whole purpose of Islam is to deny the deity of Jesus Christ. That's the whole purpose of it. I have read the Quran. I have taught on the Quran and on Islam. And I got in a lot of trouble because I made those statements. I made that statement to a class in Cherokee County. And my boss called me up and cussed me out. And he said, don't you ever, in one of my classes again, mention your Christian faith. And I said, get you somebody else to teach your class from here on, is what I said. Later on, he came back and begged me to teach it because nobody else would. And I never had more trouble with it. But Islam is, there's nothing good about Islam. It is a cult of death and suffering and torture and hell. That's all it is. And that's why they hate the Jews like they do. There is no Muslim on the face of the earth who's a true Muslim who does not want the destruction of Israel and the killing of all Jews. There are none. In Islam, in Arabic, they have a term called takir. Takir, I believe I pronounced it correctly. I'm a little bit off. From the time a child is born to a Muslim father, that child is taught not just to lie, but how to lie effectively. Takiz, I guess it is. I'm not pronouncing it correctly. I've taught on it, and the word pronunciation slips me. But when they move into an area, if they're a minority, they're taught this is how you lie effectively to the infidels. Everybody who's not a Muslim is an infidel. And this is how you lie effectively to them. But when they get to be about 10 to 20% of the population, they become New York City. You've seen that freak that they've elected to be the Democratic nominee? He's Muslim. Comes from a Muslim family. Barack Obama's a Muslim. Barack Obama hated Israel, hates Israel. That's why he supported Iran. I get carried away here. But this is from the Quran. The Quran exists to deny that Jesus is the Son of God and that he could have died. There's another place in the Quran where it says that if you say he died, that he was crucified, or you say that Allah had a son, the mountains will crumble. And that's the most horrible thing you can say to a Muslim, is that God has a son. And they teach that Jesus is real, but Jesus is a slave of Allah, it says. They teach that he's a slave of Allah. And I mentioned this morning about being a Nazareth. And there's signs everywhere warning Christians, don't you say what you believe here. Can you imagine that in America? If we put up signs that said, Muslims, don't you come in here and talk about Allah and tell us that he didn't have a son. Imagine that. But in the Muslim world where they control it, if you're non-Muslim, you have to pay I can't pronounce it again, I'm losing my pronunciation here. But you have to pay a tax to the Muslims to live there if you're not a Muslim. If you don't pay a tax, they'll kill you. They'll run you out and kill you. And what I'm telling you ain't nowhere near as bad as it is. Look at Hamas. Look at Hezbollah. That's Islam. Those are the true believers. ISIS, they're the true believers. And the reality is, once you get right down to it, that's what they all believe. So, that's recorded. It's going out. But I ran across some Muslim men up at the car wash on Jesse Jewell Parkway a while back. And I knew they were Muslim because they had the Shahada written out on the back of their van. It was in Arabic. But I knew it was Arabic. I can't read Arabic, but I knew it was Arabic. And I had a pretty good idea what it was. The Shahada is their statement of faith. And so I talked to one of them and I said, that's Arabic on your vehicle there. And he said, yes, it is. And I said, what does it say? And he says, well, it says there is no God but God, and Muhammad is the messenger of God, except they use the term Allah. And that's the Shahada. I said, oh, that's the Shahada. And he said, are you a brother? And I said, no. I'm a student of what you believe. And they were all excited when they thought they'd found an American Muslim brother up there with them. But that's how committed they are to their faith, and they will kill you. I don't know if you saw where in Turkey they're arresting people, the government's arresting people because somebody drew a cartoon that supposedly had Muhammad in it. In the Muslim world, if you draw anything depicting Muhammad, they will imprison you. Well, I got caught up there. Let me move on. But anyway, this is the claim that somebody died in the place of Jesus on the cross. And particularly the Muslims teach that and believe that. They also teach that when the hidden Imam returns at the end of the world, the end of the age, that Jesus is going to come with him and serve him. That's what they teach. Just the stuff of legend, I won't go into it, but N.T. Wright points out that one of the reasons that the story of Christ and his resurrection cannot be a legend is because legends usually take several generations to develop, a lot of time. And they were writing about the resurrection of Jesus immediately almost after his resurrection. And that's what he talks about here. And then the wrong tomb, we covered that pretty good. So we won't go through that again. Hallucinations, we didn't cover that one. One of the claims is that all these people who claimed they saw the resurrected Christ were hallucinating. They don't know anything about hallucinations in psychology, of course, and that's what this points out. That you can't have mass hallucinations and they'll be the same thing. It only happens with individuals. And so that's one of the things they try to claim. Oh, all these people had hallucinations and thought they saw the risen Jesus, the living Jesus. It's absurd, of course. The swoon theory, we covered that, where they said he revived in the tomb. We went into great detail on that one. And here, David Friedrich Strauss said that such a resuscitation could only have weakened the impression which he had made upon them in life and in death, at the most could only have given it and, I don't know what that word is. Anybody know what that word is? Mournful voice, but could by no possibility have changed their sorrow into enthusiasm, have elevated their reverence into worship. And so he said if indeed they saw him coming out of the tomb as a man who had been tortured and crucified and could barely get along, they were not going to be impressed. But when they saw him in his resurrection, powerful, glorified body, they were impressed forevermore. The body's stolen. We covered that. How absurd that is, everything about it. And here, Josh McDowell says, if such a rebuttal failed, why didn't they explain exactly where Jesus' body lay? If this failed, why didn't they recover the corpse, put it on a cart, wheel it through the center of Jerusalem? Such an action would have destroyed Christianity not in the cradle but in the womb, he says. Because they didn't have the body because it was resurrected. And so a couple more. The resurrection's a fact. Some of these great theologians who give their take on it, and they all say there can't be any doubt that based on all the information we have, all the things that have transpired down through the centuries, there can be no doubt. Then the great sign which God has given us, that Christ died and rose again from the dead, he says. Here's another one. Raking all the evidence together, it is not too much to say that there is no historic incident better or more variously supported than the resurrection of Christ. In the ancient world especially, there's nothing that comes close to establishing through the facts that we know, the events that we know, that he was resurrected and is resurrected. And then this is about the last one. There exists no document, this is Clark Pennant, there exists no document from the ancient world witnessed by so excellent a set of textual and historical testimonies. An honest person cannot dismiss a source of this kind. Skepticism regarding the historical credentials of Christianity is based upon an irrational basis. He says if you deny in the face of all this evidence, in the face of this historical record, in the face of all of these witness testimony, if you deny the resurrection of Jesus, it's irrational. You're not a rational person. You're not an honest person. And so, Jesus said to Thomas, be not faithless, but believing, as he offered him the opportunity to examine his scars. That's by a great painter of Renaissance named Caravaggio. He painted some real realistic scenes like that from the Bible. And so, why seek you the living among the dead? The women were asked. We don't look for him among the dead. He's very much alive on the right hand of the Father. And I've gone a little bit over here. Let me say this. I finished this section. If y'all want to, we'll come back one more night if you want to. And we'll do a cursory overview of the shroud and the sudarium if you want to do that. I've taught on it here some before in fairly good detail. But we'll look at some of the highlights since that's such critical evidence. Maybe the best physical evidence that we have certainly is still in existence today. So we'll do one more night then, and then we'll conclude this study. And I appreciate all y'all being a part of it. Is there a question or a comment before we go? Probably don't want to ask about Islam. We was in Akka. Akka is an old crusader town on the Mediterranean. And they took us there because they said, here we have an example of the beautiful coexistence of Christians, Jews, and Muslims. Well, it wasn't that way. But they wanted us to believe it was. So they took us and they introduced us to a priest of an Eastern Orthodox church. His wife handed out what I thought was strong coffee till I turned it up, and it was some kind of strong wine. So I asked for another one. No, I didn't. And they carried us to this place. Well, anyway, they carried us to a mosque, a Muslim mosque there. Of course, they wouldn't let us in, which I was glad of. I wasn't going in anyway. And they had the imam of that mosque. The imam is like the pastor or the overseer of the mosque. And this guy was Palestinian, and he was a bodybuilder. He was a massive fella, a bodybuilder. He was one of the most arrogant people I've ever seen in my life. He could speak several languages, but he refused to speak English to us, and he refused to speak Hebrew. And so when I got there, I sat in the back because I wanted to be as far away from him as I could be. And they said this is the third most holy Islamic site in Israel. The third most, the holy site to them in the world is Jerusalem and the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock. But this was the third most holy Muslim site in Israel. And the reason it was, now get this, the reason it was they had one of Muhammad's whiskers there. They were proud. They said, we got one of Muhammad's whiskers. And I wanted to say, wow, but I kept my mouth shut. Well, these mosques all over the world, they have Muhammad's whiskers. And my guess is if you DNA'd them, none of them would match the same man, would be my guess. But anyway, they were going to take us into this mosque. And I wasn't going to go in that mosque. That was a hellish place to me. Well, all these people I was with, they just spent their nights in the bars anyway, so they didn't know what they was doing much, and they were going to go in. So I fell back to the back of the entourage, the group there, and I spied some bushes, some thick bushes over here on the side of the mosque. And I was looking for the trail I was going to take and hiding in bushes while I was in there, because they said, you got to take your shoes off if you come in here. I ain't going to take my shoes off, and I ain't going in there. So anyway, but at the last minute, and I believe that this was providence, they decided we were unworthy, and they wouldn't let us in their mosque. And I was the happiest man in Akka at that point, that not only was I not going to have to go in, or they were going to try to get me in, but nobody else was. So this imam, as I said, he was an egotistical man. You have to be a bodybuilder anyway. And there was an elderly Palestinian man there. And he treated him like a dog. He was a dog to him, I'm sure. And the old man, he would stand there and he would keep his head down and he would bow. And he'd say something to him in his language. And the old man would bow. And so as we went out, I was the last one to go out, and I looked at him. And in the Islamic world, if you do this, you're saying that I respect you. And that's the only time I've done that in my life. But when I went out, I looked at that old man, and he bowed. And I bowed, put my hand on my chest. The last part, they kidded me about that the rest of the time we was there, because some of the people in the group I had known for years. And they would say, oh, guess who we'd go somewhere, they'd say, guess who the featured speaker is here tonight there, John? The imam from Akka. I'd say, I ain't staying. Of course, that's kidding. But the last thing was, and I was proud to see this, about 2 years after that, I was reading an article where he had appeared in a muscle man contest, a bodybuilding contest, and he wore his Speedos, and they kicked him out of the mosque and took away his imamship because he appeared mostly naked in front of the world. And Muslim imams apparently can't do that. But I rather enjoyed seeing that he got kicked out of his mosque. So I guess there's some things that overcome your Islamic faith, and one of them is your bodybuilding if you're a big old muscular fellow. But anyway, I didn't like it. And I used a word for him that I won't use here. When people ask me what I thought about him, I won't say what it was that I said I thought about him, but it wasn't all that bad, but it wasn't appropriate to say here. Anything before we go? So y'all not going to ask anything about Islam. I can see you're not. Get me wound up, sure enough. I appreciate you coming. And so we'll go. Raymond, how about dismissing us, please, sir?